Started. So good afternoon, everybody. Good afternoon, everybody. We are going to call this edition of the February Oregon Sustainable Healthcare Cost Growth Target Implementation Committee to order. That's a mouthful. What we wanted to do today is just make sure we quickly review the agenda. I'll turn it over to Jeremy for that review of the agenda. But just be aware that we are going to be having public testimony twice today. We're going to have that first opportunity around 1:45 to allow public testimony on what we've had, what we've gone through first. And then we'll have a second public testimony as well. So before we go through the agenda itself, did everybody get a chance to review the January meeting minutes? And any corrections or changes to those minutes? We don't need to have a formal adoption, but just want to entertain any changes. All right, and hearing none, we'll go ahead. Let's do quick introductions for today, and then we'll move on with the agenda setting itself.
Jeremy Vandy, Director of Health Policy and Analytics, and just remember to speak into your microphone.
John McConnell, Center for Health Systems Effectiveness at Oregon Health and Science University.
Catherine Correa, Legacy Health.
Andrew Stolpe, Insurance Commissioner and Administrator within the Department of Consumer Business Services.
Shannon Saldivar, Small Business Owner, Insurance Agent, and representing the Marketplace Advisory Committee.
Craig Anderson, I'm the Chief Actuary at Mona Health.
Pat Allen, Director of the Oregon Health Authority.
Lisa Higgins, Political Director for SEIU.
Jordan Pepe, CEO of the Pepe Group.
Jenny Smith, Kind Permanente.
And Mark McMullen, Oregon Office of Economic Analysis.
Megan Burns, Baylor Health.
Michael Baylor from Baylor Health.
Jen Wheelander with St. Charles Health System.
Kevin Retcher, Pacific Source.
Jessica Gomez, World Valley Microdevices.
And I'm Kevin Iwanchina. I'm Chief Medical Officer of Intercommunity Health Plans in Corvallis, a family doc, and President for the Oregon Medical Association. I'm acting as your Vice Chair today, and I will be Jack's eyes as Jack is joining by phone. So now we'll move to introductions for those on the phone. We thought we were having two. Maybe they'll join us as we are going through the agenda.
Jack Derby, are you guys on? Can you hear us? Okay, well, hopefully they'll tune in, or maybe you can send them an email and make sure that they're logged in.
All right, so Jeremy, can I turn to you just to set the tone for the agenda today and do a quick review before we jump in?
Sure. So, big meeting today, as folks know, will be a couple of the biggest decisions that this group will make in this process. Not the only big decisions, but some of the big ones. So, just quickly, kind of what's on the agenda overall. So we've got the cost growth target. Today's really the focus is on trying to get to the cost growth target and what that methodology will be and how often we'll update it. So we've got that split into two components. First, we're going to go through some of the indicators and numbers, picking up on the conversation last month. We're going to break for a public comment period for any public comment that we have before the group gets into trying to land that final decision. We'll come back after the break, try to land the decision and land the decision on what the initial cost growth target is going to be. And then we're going to move into some of the methodology of things like how often is it updated, how long will the target last for. Then we're going to start to get into, and I will warn you to sort of brace for impact here, we're going to get into a couple of pretty weedy conversations around things like risk adjustment and attribution. And I will just say at the outset that we know this is really in the weeds. We're trying to not have this group have to get too deep in the weeds on each of the topics as we go through the agendas this year, but this is one that is sort of core to how this program is going to work and how we're going to sort of measure cost growth at an insurer and provider level. So this is probably maybe one of the more weedy conversations that you might get pulled into, and we won't. Hopefully it gets better from here, not worse. But I'll just tell you to just brace for impact so that your heads may explode a little bit. And then towards the end of the day, we're gonna start to move into the data use strategy, starting with pretty light touch around kind of goals and principles and what we mean by data use strategy. What we're really talking about here is what data is needed to really support this overall program, and what's the analysis and work that the agency will do as part of the program. So this will really be starting to open up that conversation, and then we'll get much more into it in March. I'll have a couple more comments here in a minute, but I also just kind of stage setting. We recognize this is a big decision today in terms of the target. And recognize that this is going to be something that the group's really going to probably need to grapple with, and there's probably going to be some differences of opinion at the outset, and that's okay. We really want to make sure that folks all have the opportunity to be heard. Our goal is to get to consensus, and by consensus we mean hopefully something that everybody can agree with, but at least not oppose and can live with. And so we want to really make sure that everybody has a chance for open dialogue, and recognize that whatever the target is going to be, it's probably going to be a little bit scary and a little bit hard for us to figure out how we get there. But we want to make sure the group walks away today really feeling like you landed in a good spot that that you're supportive of. So Kevin and I, our primary job today is make sure that that everybody gets their voice heard in this process.
So the only other thing that I'll add is that when I look around the room, I truly feel honored to be part of this group. We all have a varied and diverse skill set, and this is exactly why we were asked to be part of this implementation committee. So let's make sure that this diversity and variation in what we do doesn't get in the way of still our common goal of getting to consensus for this specific rate target, while we're honoring the diversity and the skill sets that we have in the room today. I feel we can do this. I feel the state needs us to do this, and let's move forward.
I think Ruby's on. Jack and Ruby, can you guys hear us?
Yeah.
And can we hear you?
They're going to switch the number that they're calling in on.
Okay, great. All right, so they'll be back on a new number here in a second.
Right, so I'm going to turn it over to Jeremy at this point in time. We'll go through some OHA updates.
Yeah, just a couple of quick updates. We've talked in the past about sort of other stakeholder and public engagement that we've been doing. So we've been making rounds at sort of the pace that folks have been inviting us through a series of one-on-one conversations and group conversations. I don't think a lot to report back at this point. It's been mostly filling folks in on where we're at. You do have two public comments written public comments that came in. One from the Hospital Association. We did meet with a group of hospital leaders on Friday, and I think that a lot of their comments are largely captured in the written comments that are in front of you. But I would say my kind of overall takeaway, and we'll enter there, so feel free to jump in, was I think there's a desire for, at the end of this process, that there's a sort of desire from the hospitals to make sure there's an opportunity to provide some context around what they're seeing as challenges that are ultimately leading to cost and cost increases. And so, charity care at Denton has come up as one of those. You can see in the letter there's some others around things like public health and behavioral health. And so I think a lot of that we want to come back to when we get into the data use strategy conversation of what data are we collecting and what's ultimately going into our analysis. But that's sort of one key thing that I've kept hearing from conversations with hospitals. We're starting to work through how we'll engage tribes in this process. So one of the directions to us was to include additional tribal spending if tribes wanted to be included. So we're starting to map that out with our agency tribal liaison. We expect that's going to be sort of on its own timeline, and in terms of having the conversations with tribes at the pace that they want to have those conversations. And at least an initial discussion, it sounds like the state has never really been engaged in funding that flows from IHS to the tribes, and so there's some sensitivity around that. Probably a good chance that they don't want to have that included as part of this, but we'll have that conversation with them probably later this spring when it makes sense. And then just sort of a reminder process-wise. So this group's making recommendations to the Health Policy Board and a final report that we hope the Policy Board will adopt. So we're starting to map out some updates to the Policy Board in more depth as we go through this process. So we'll have a pretty lengthy update in March, and then likely in May and going into the summer. We'll come back to this kind of at the end, but you also have in your packet a list of the schedule for the rest of the meetings and topics between now and June. And we think we are still on track to be able to get all of this done, but we have a lot to get done between now and June. So just kind of want folks to keep that in mind as we're working through things. We want to make sure we move through at the pace that is needed to get folks comfortable, but at the same time, we're starting to get to the spot where we can't really push off conversations too much longer without needing to extend meetings or add meetings. So big decision today, but lots more work to still to come after today.
So does anybody have any questions specifically for Jeremy related to those OHA updates? All right. Hearing none, we're going to move on to the next section, and we did have some follow-up points to be done and conversed about from the prior meeting. So I'm going to turn it over to Megan at this point in time to walk us through the cost growth target, the application at the various 4 levels. Or are you going to be doing that, Michael?
So Megan's a little under the weather and
All right.
her voice a little taxed, so you're going to hear a little more from me and a little less from her.
Right. Thank you.
At this meeting. The graphic that you have both in your packets and in front of you is really to serve as a reminder of the application of the cost growth target. So when we talk today about setting a cost growth target, it will be for a statewide cost growth target of nearly all spending, as we've talked about before. But the assessment of performance against the cost growth target will be applied at 4 discrete levels, and those are depicted here on this slide. So below the statewide level are what we've referred to as market levels: Medicare, Medicaid, and commercial being the 3 markets. Commercial inclusive of both insured and self-insured coverage. And then below that are the insurer and provider levels. And you can see for Medicare, it's separate measurement for traditional Medicare, which references fee-for-service here, and Medicare Advantage. And for Medicaid, it's the part of Medicaid that is still traditional fee-for-service and not CCO spending. And then finally, there's a provider level. And we will talk in some detail about which insurers and which providers, both today and in our next meeting. But generally stated, at the provider level, we're focused on large providers who will have a sufficient number of attributed members that it will be possible to conduct performance measurement that is statistically meaningful. Okay, there's a lot more to be said on that topic, and we won't go into detail on that today. But suffice it to say, this is not every provider in the state, because it's simply not possible to do so. So it's large providers. What we are suggesting here is actually 3 large categories of measurement: large providers, small providers who might be grouped together, so we would assess, so what does spending growth look like for small providers all aggregated together, and then spending associated with care delivered to Oregonians who are not attributed to any provider. And I'm going to explain, as Jeremy said, the whole attribution part. I'm not going to make anyone's head explode, but I will talk about that later. So this is really to serve as a reminder that the target is being set at the statewide level, but the performance assessment will be applied at multiple levels. John?
Yeah, could you make, so what's an example of somebody who would be left out or wouldn't be accountable at that bottom row? What does that look like?
So this past year, the only health care that I sought was an ED visit. Okay, I would not be connected to a provider, and this gets into the attribution discussion why it would not be connected to a provider, but I'll explain that later.
Can I? So just to follow up. So let's say there was one ED that had hundreds of thousands of people like you.
Yeah.
And so, but their price was going up a lot. Would they, because patients were attributed there, is it sort of the accountabilities that relies on some patient?
So what we're going to propose is the accountability be connected to a primary care relationship. And so if I only had an ED visit, I don't have defined primary care relationship, so I am unattributed. But we're going to go into this in great detail so that you all can wrestle with this and provide a recommendation. Okay?
Can I follow up?
Yes, please.
So just to kind of build off John's comment, I think that, so if I understand it, the emergency room visit might be at a higher level. So if it was with an insurer for a commercial
Right.
patient, it'd be at that insurer level.
Mm-hmm.
But when you say the target's at a statewide, so we're successful if we hit the statewide target, but one level down, does that mean we're trying to hit the target at each, say, Medicare, Medicaid, commercial independently? Or is that
Yes.
more-
Yes, we would like to be able to, most years, for most of these smaller cells, hit the target.
Okay, so I think by definition, maybe we'll get into this later. At a statewide level, if that's true, we will be below the target at a statewide level because we will either be at or below at each individual cell. So when you roll that up.
Right, if each cell is below, then de facto will be below at the statewide level.
So let me just, so I think the point of this slide is to show where we're trying to measure the whatever the number is, right? So we're going to try to measure it on average statewide basis, measure it at a market basis, measure it at an insured basis, measure it at a provider basis, but we have to get into the weeds of how are we going to do that and what claims can be attached. I think then it's a separate conversation down the road for if we're not hitting the target in any individual one of these, what happens? What's the accountability and when does that kick in?
Right, we are not talking about accountability today. This is just to talk about how measurement is to be conducted.
That is the point, right? The target is statewide level.
Yes,
We are not talking about breaking down without any measurement period to break down a particular target and further regulate.
it's a state target and we are assessing performance at state levels.
Yes, but the target is one. And
Yes, it's one.
Yeah.
One
It's just one.
You're not gonna have a.
No, we're not having multiple targets. No. Jordan?
So to clarify, where I don't know if Jenny and I are hearing it the same way, there's one target, but the one target is assessed at the statewide level. The one target is assessed at the Medicare level. The one target is assessed at the Medicaid level. The one target is assessed at the commercial level.
Yes.
So,
No.
This is it.
Well, it's at all the levels for insurers and providers. Okay, so we're going to look at the whole state, then we're going to look at the 3 different markets, and then below that, we're going to look at insurers as they operate within the 3 different markets. And then below that, we're going to look at providers as large providers, as they operate within the 3 different markets.
So I was having this conversation with Jeremy, and I think where the confusion comes in is the commercial side of this is always concerned that when you grab onto the balloon in a certain area, it pops out in another area, usually in the private sector. Now, if I'm a hospital concerned about whether I'm hitting my target, I'm concerned about hitting the amalgamated target. So if I was high on commercial but low on Medicaid, then I hit my target. But the
No.
private sector is going to be more interested in, did I hit my target in commercial?
Yeah, well, so this is the best thing that could happen to commercial because there is no target for commercial right now. And now there will be one for commercial spend. And the hospital, if it's large enough to be assessed for all 3 of those markets, will be assessed against the target for their commercial, for their Medicare, and for their Medicaid. Why is that confusing, Jordan?
Well, because we're supposed to pick a number today that we feel comfortable with.
Really?
And I just, say for rounding purposes, we end up picking one that's closer to 4%. But we have a Medicaid and a Medicare rate that's 3.4%. And by averages, commercial, if it makes up 50%, is not at 4%, it's at 4.6%.
Right, but the unit of measurement is going to be commercial at the insurer level and commercial at the provider level. So you're right, you could get to the target at the statewide level, but we're also going to assess underneath it because our objective is that all of those sub-levels, we also come in at or below the target.
Okay, that's what I thought I heard the last go around.
Mhm.
That's not what Jenny said.
I don't think it's getting technical, right? You're getting the cost issues, right? Costs are measured, claim, say. So I do think it's important to come back with you, so we're not clear. One target, and it triangulates with the accountability issues, right? You can't hold the insurer accountable, you can't also hold the provider accountable, but who's the market? So it's a commercial data roll up all together, the market gets to 1.6. So it just, I think, takes a bit of time for people grounding, and we don't need to call it today. As long as we believe that our goal today is getting the target of the state.
Right, but we want everyone to understand that it's a target that's then going to, with performance being assessed at all of these levels below the statewide level. That's why we have this slide up here, so that you understand that the future measurement strategy will be to look below statewide and see what's happening.
See what's happening versus have a target for commercial market.
No.
In my mind.
Yeah, all right, so let me clarify. And see what's happening is to see whether the commercial market, the Medicare market, the Medicaid market met the target. And whether insurers operating in those markets met the target. Independently. Okay, so you can't say as an insurer, I met the target even though my commercial rates went up 15%, so I'm happy because everything else was -2%. Because there's going to be a separate mechanism for assessing performance just for the commercial market. And an objective that most years in most of these cells, we're going to come in at or below the target.
Is that different than Massachusetts, where they're doing it at all levels?
Right.
Okay. And
then this is identical to all of the other states, what I'm describing.
Okay, and then, so if you hit the statewide, but you miss one of these other ones underneath, then what happens? I guess that'll be a later discussion.
That will be a later discussion. Today, we just want to set the value. In terms of what happens, that's a whole separate meeting discussion for us. And I think for purposes of advancing today's meeting agenda, we best put it aside.
So let me just give an example. In Massachusetts, in 1 year, the state hit its statewide target, but if you look at the market level, Medicaid did not. And so then they investigated, why did Medicaid not hit the target? And they discovered that was the year Sovaldi, one of the major Hep C drugs, came out. And so there was an understanding of the layer below the statewide. So instead of saying, okay, great, we met statewide, we're done, it gave deeper insight into the reasons why the state is or is not meeting, markets are or are not meeting the same target.
I hate to belabor this. Before meeting, we got to get through it. But I'll give you another example. The rumors in the Medicare for the next 5 years, right? You're going to see from the care needs, simply from the 65-year-old to the 75-year-old, or the hip replacement, everything's going to have sort of a life cycle management perspective. So for the next like 3 years, you see Medicare all of a sudden, because care needs exceeding a certain target, in the aggregate, you get balanced out. So how does it work? So just from a population needs perspective, it might fit into different timing horizon. So just a case study we can solve later, but more of a nuance can come later.
All sorts of things happen year over year, right? I mean, Sovaldi was an example. Worse flu season. There are lots of things that happen. But the idea here behind this strategy is to set a target to create some type of discipline. Now, if, as in the example Megan gave, performance is above a target at any of these levels, there's opportunity to figure out why. And is the reason one that appears to be a justifiable one, or one that really can't be easily explained? But that's what you do after you assess performance against the target. What we want to do today is set the target. okay? What happens after the performance assessment, that's what we will talk about, and you will provide recommendations on that very question.
So in order to help set that target, it might be important now to start going through the target methodology.
Yes.
So let's
Right.
start.
So as a reminder, we have, you can't read this very well, but we've got 5 work streams. Today we are still far left on cost growth target. We're going to dip our toes into data use strategy if we are at all able to do so at the end of the meeting. So just brief follow-up from the last meeting. You received 3 documents prior to this meeting. One is a summary of the recommendations that you have made to date. The second is a table of follow-up items from prior meetings. These are requests that you made, and it provides their status. And then finally, a meeting schedule. And I think we're going to put a little bit more detail into the agendas for the next 4 meetings so you can see where we are going. But we have 4 more meetings before we try to pull things together. I just want to note for you that this is not the cumulative meeting today. While it might feel that way because we're making a big decision, we actually have a lot more content to cover that's in our legislative charge that we will move on to, and frankly, that are relevant to the cost growth target. Okay. All right, so part 1, cost growth target methodology. This is not the part that Jeremy said will make your head explode, so enjoy the journey. So, by the way, Sarah, Tara, is there any way we can get rid of lamp usage 1014? No?
We can try everybody at the break, but so far it's working.
Okay, all right, thanks. So, so we have 3 goals for today. The first is to recommend an initial value of the cost growth target. And as we just discussed, the same value will apply to all of the levels of measurement. 2, we're going to want to talk about how long should the cost growth target be in effect. Are we setting a 1-year target, a 10-year target? We'll explore options there. And 3, will the cost growth target for whatever the time period is be constant, or will it change? That's something else that you will need to weigh in on. So in terms of the initial value of the target, on January 8th, we had a great conversation about the indicator to which the cost growth target should be tethered. And we discussed we discussed 3 general categories. The state economy, wages and income, and inflation. And I think you dismissed inflation. You were split, however, on the other indicators. At the end of the meeting, there was general agreement, but not universal agreement, to tie healthcare cost growth to a measure of the state economy, but then to potentially adjust it based on measures of wage and income growth. You had that conversation without actually having any data. So you'll have the opportunity, now that you do have some data, to reconsider that. So I want to recommend that we do not revisit this issue, because I think once you have data in front of you, then you can revisit it in a data-informed manner. Before looking at the data and talking about the path ahead, we want to refresh your understanding of what the economic outlook looks like for the state and share with you some historical and forecast values. And Mark has put together some slides for this purpose. And so I'm going to turn to him to narrate our discussion of the next few slides.
Yeah, my apologies for the aside here. But in the conversation on the 8th, there were a lot of very interesting comments and questions about the economic indicators, and I was hoping to get a common understanding of the background of what these things look like in Oregon and help you make a decision. I'm sorry, it doesn't look like I used the right font colors there. You can't see the U.S. line on the chart, but you certainly can on your handouts. The first chart here is just to convey the point that Oregon's economy is a real boom-bust phenomenon. This picture right here is a picture about jobs, but whether we use jobs or income or gross state product or whatever it may be, you would get the exact same picture, which is here you see that the dark line, Oregon, in terms of job growth and every single expansion, outperforms the U.S. And that would be true even if I took this all the way back to World War II. And every single expansion, Oregon has outperformed the U.S. Our problem is not the expansions, it's that during the recessions, we usually outperform the U.S. as well and have these spectacular recessions with thousands and thousands of job losses. And so, why is that? You know, what creates that pattern? Well, there are really two main factors. One would be we're still a place that makes things, with manufacturing and the resource industries and the like that we have. We're not immune to the globalization and what's happened to a lot of these industries. Our workforce used to be at, a third in manufacturing in the 70s, and now we're down to 10% or so, which is obviously a big change. But relative to other states, that performance is very, very good. We've lost many fewer jobs in terms of the share of our economy. And over time, our share of the overall U.S. manufacturing industry has been increasing in good times and bad. With only a couple of hiccups during the 80s when the timber industries went away, and then again during the housing downturn, which also hit our wood products very, very hard. So whatever we do, in terms of these indicators, just keep in mind that they will fluctuate quite a bit more than what we see in other states, and typically will be higher on average than what we see in other states. So perhaps more importantly than the manufacturing side of things for why we get this sort of pattern of boom bust is population growth and migration trends, which is the second slide. And again, I apologize for the light blue here, but whenever Oregon has jobs available, people want to come here. This has happened since the time of Lewis and Clark. My partner, the Oregon office says since the land bridge, but I don't think we have data going back that far. But in general, this is our comparative advantage, that when jobs are here, we get people, and not just anybody. We get highly skilled folks who are willing to come here, and they're willing to come here at a discount. Oregon doesn't have MIT or Stanford University or anything like that, but we can get engineers from there to come, again, at a lower cost than the regions that compete with us. And so, not only so this is a great boon, of course, for our employers, which is the main benefit for this, but it's also, works circularly in terms of when we do have households come in and bring in their income, they bring in their demand for health services and housing, the retail trade and things like that. So this has created this boom-bust cycle where Oregon tends to outperform, and will be more and more dependent on this migration going forward. As you see in the light blue section is the natural rate of population growth, which would be the number of births minus the number of deaths, and soon that's going to go negative, given the demographic flows that are going on. In fact, in over half of our counties today, we're already below water, so we have to depend much more heavily on migration, which should be okay in the near term because of the millennial population cohort are in their moving years, and we expect that to continue. One quick comment, though, is this last year of population growth data, which didn't get in this chart because it was released after I produced these, does not look good. Both from the PSU estimates and the census estimates are off quite a bit from this, and would be a risk to the outlook. If Oregon loses this comparative advantage because of high housing costs or lack of jobs or whatnot, that's something that we have to worry about going forward. But that said, there are a lot of indications that's still there. If we look at some of the other measures of population, school enrollments, and driver's license surrender at the DMV. If you move from California and you come to Oregon, you go to the DMV and you turn in your driver's license. That's usually very highly correlated. So we're waiting for the census 2020 to find out what we'll get a real hard number before we make a real change in the outlook. But for these purposes, again, just to state whether we're using a population type driver or income or output or whatnot, we expect that volatility to continue. So the next chart is about median household income. And this is, we did get a lot of comments on this in the last round. One being, isn't it true that real, inflation-adjusted household incomes are stagnant in Oregon and the U.S.? And well, until very recently, yes, that has been true. They bounce up and down in recessions and expansions, but over the 25, 30-year period, there really was no growth. Until, again, most recently in this long, strong expansion. The second thing to take away is, well, where do we sit relative vis-a-vis the U.S., which is, again, the impossible to see light blue line up there on the screen, where we did take this huge step back when all of our mills and resource industries restructured at the end of the 70s and the 80s, and remained below the U.S. up until, again, this very most recent cycle, when not only have we caught up, but surpassed the state as well. But not everyone has benefited from this. The next chart is about job polarization. So what we're looking at here, now this is not just an Oregon phenomenon. This is a nationwide phenomenon, and it's not just this business cycle, but the last several, where during recessions, the middle wage jobs, and here they're roughly defined as $30,000 to $55,000 in wages a year. If you just take all the different occupations and line them up from low wage to high wage, and take that chunk in the middle, it's somewhere right around 30 to 55,000 a year. So this includes our teachers, construction workers, manufacturing folks, healthcare support workers, and the like. And most of the workers in the economy are in this bucket, but unfortunately, it's not doing as well. Both high wage and low wage industries have. To read this chart, you start at the left, and we went into the recession at zero right when that's the peak of the employment cycle. Then, throughout the recession, all sorts of occupations lost jobs, but 4/5 of those job losses came from this middle wage chunk, and they're almost just back to their peak now after 10 years of expansion. So we're really getting this distribution or difference in performance, which is important in terms of the measure we use. When we look at a median measure, we're really kind of picking out this sort of middle of the road household, and not necessarily being skewed by how well the folks at the top may be doing. So why is this going on? The biggest evil here is technology, which has been really hitting the middle wage jobs the hardest. You have, if you ever tour a timber mill here in the state, they only have 4 or 5 workers on the floor anymore. It's amazing. They've really moved out everyone, but it's not just the heavy industries that have benefited, as well as office jobs as well, administrative assistants. Remember that old TV show Mad Men? They had every advertising executive had their administrative assistant's office chair sitting right outside their office. Well, now we have one administrative assistant with Microsoft Office run the calendars of several executives all at once. And so there's a whole lot of pressure, and this really does manifest itself during recessions, and this last one was no outlier in that regard.
So Mark, before you go into the next slide, we're just going to do a quick pause and make sure that Jack and Ruby can now hear us, and that we can hear them. Jack, Ruby, can you hear us?
This is Ruby.
Yep, we can hear you, Ruby.
Yeah, hi guys, it's Jack, and we can hear. Yep, I hope you can hear me.
Yeah, we can hear you as well, Jack.
Yeah, I can hear Mark well, and I can definitely hear you, Jeremy. But in deference to the ladies in the room, could you all please eat the mic? I cannot hear you clearly.
So just a reminder to everybody, eat the mic.
Right. And guys, the other thing that would be helpful, could you let us know which slide number you are on from time to time so we can follow?
We'll do that. So go ahead.
Okay, thank you.
So like I say, whether we choose income or output or whatnot, those are pretty similar concepts. Slide number 20 shows that, well, population, and we also, although a strict population or inflation type of measure didn't get a whole lot of support last time, population or some combination of population and inflation was on the original menu. The slide 20 kind of shows the age distribution of our population here in Oregon, which, unlike most places, our millennial population cohort is just as big as our baby boom population cohort, and just as important, but not necessarily just as important for healthcare spending. on the whole, you know, or out of household expenditures, about 8% is on medical services or healthcare, and 2/3 of that is, you know, payments to insurers and whatnot for the typical household. But there is no typical household. It certainly varies by age, and so any use of a population inflation kind of concept would have to bear that in mind. So in terms of this, although the millennial cohort and the baby boomer cohort here are the same size, they're certainly not in terms of spending. Millennial population cohort are spending just a little over 5% of all their expenditures on health care. Baby boomers over twice that at 12, 13% on health care. And then of course, as we get over 75, it's even higher at 16 or 17%. The only thing really dwarfing it would be food and housing, which is slide number 21 shows how the CPI for Western states is created, which is based on a basket of goods that would be typical spending. And so medical care again is 8% or so, which is about the same data that comes out of the Consumer Expenditure Survey, and it's together with housing are the ones that are really driving the overall inflation, at least in the West. In terms of how we differ from the rest of the U.S., it's really all that housing. Not only is it the biggest chunk of spending, but it's extremely volatile here and has been outstripping other regions of the country. Therefore, has been doing a lot of work. And so, with that in mind, if we did connect population inflation, one thing is, is that appropriate to look at, the CPI as a measure with housing, and to make sure that we would want to weight that population by expenditure by age, so that we made a better demand concept for healthcare spending. So I didn't want to take up too much time on an aside, but hopefully that helped guide the discussion. If anyone has any follow-ups, my contact's on the next slide.
Any comments, questions for Mark?
Question. On the first slide, why non-farm employment was excluded?
Yes, the payroll survey looks at non-farm employment. That's traditional just because of some seasonality of a lot of the farm workers. So this particular survey just goes around and knocks on businesses' doors and asks them how many workers do you have. There are other surveys, the household survey in particular, where the unemployment rate comes from and the like, where they knock on doors of households and say, how many do you have a job? And those do include farm workers. But it's a small piece, and it wouldn't really change the growth rates all that much, just makes it more volatile.
Okay, so I want to push us on because we've got a lot of ground to cover. Thank you, Mark, for that context. At the last meeting, we talked about different indicators. I'm now going to review with you data to help inform our discussion. As a reminder, all the indicators that we've looked at can be looked at historically or in terms of a forward-looking forecast. For our historical analyses, we have generally looked at 20 years look back. That's a way to manage around big swings in the economy and especially managing the Great Recession. So if we had used something shorter, then the figures would have been heavily colored by the experience of the Great Recession. The forecast values come from two sources. One is from an independent economic firm, IHS Economics. They provide data to lots of states, Oregon being one. The exception is the PGSP calculation, and that's something that we calculated using data both from the Congressional Budget Office and from Mark's office. So this is just a reminder, we have two measures of economic growth, gross state product and potential gross state product. They are in concept covering the same thing, but they're not calculated exactly the same way. Gross state product, which is a historical measure, looks at, you can see here, labor income, business taxes, and capital income. Potential growth state product is an attempt to forecast what economic growth will be. We are using values from year 5 to year 10 into the future. Those tend to be pretty constant values. And I will note that potential gross state product, the forecast, is certainly informed by historical data. So if you wonder, how do you come up with the estimates? Well, it's in part influenced by what longer-term historical experience has been. So that's just a refresher. This next slide shows you in detail the formula for determining gross state product and potential gross state product. And as I said, the inputs are not identical, and for that reason, if you wanted to forecast gross state product, which is different than calculating potential gross state product, you wouldn't wind up with the exact same number. So why would we look at potential gross state product? Just as a reminder, the reason we are looking at this measure is because this is a measure that Massachusetts, Delaware, and Rhode Island have all used to define their cost growth target. That's why we introduced it to you. But this shows you the mathematical formulas for making the determinations of the two rates. Well, I say rates, this can be calculated both on a gross basis and on a per capita basis, and we, of course, are interested in how it changes over time.
Question?
Yes?
Is there a substantive reason to use it?
Meaning, is it any better than forecasting?
Yeah, what would be the implications of one versus the other?
Yeah. Mark, do you have an opinion on that?
Yeah, the point of potential gross state product is to try to abstract away from the business side, the booms and the busts. It's looking at potential labor force growth and potential productivity growth, meaning just the trend level, potential not being as much as you could possibly get, or the maximum, but rather the way it's defined is at a full employment level or some sort of sense of in regular good time, because of course the economy can overheat and be growing above potential for a while, and that we may be doing today, and then of course be severely below potential in these recessions. And so the concept here is to try to just flatten out those boom busts that we would see in the cyclical movement that you see in actual real estate product, and try to look at more of a trend.
And our goal with the target is to have something that would be constant and stable despite swings that inevitably happen with the economy. So here's some real numbers. This is the Oregon State economy looking backwards 20 years and using the PGSP forecast that we performed. And as I noted, this is years 5 to 10 out, so that's why it begins with 2025. I don't know that I'm going to offer any further commentary, but I just have to say these are the values.
And all the numbers are per capita that we're showing today.
It's all per capita.
And they're all nominal. They have not been adjusted for inflation.
Right, no adjustment for inflation. The historical is simply a flat average of what the change was in the nominal rate for those 20 years.
Have the other states experienced any barriers or challenges using the forecasted one, the potential? I mean, is it, because I noticed that it's calculated by the committee staff. I mean, is it something that is easy to calculate?
It's super easy to calculate. Okay. So that formula that you see on the right is very easy. It's very transparent. That's another plus. So, I mentioned, IHS creates forecasts. Well, that's a proprietary forecasting model, and we don't know exactly how that's done. If you use PGSP, you know exactly what the inputs are, and you can show someone the calculations.
So for the historical data 3.5, healthcare industry included?
Yeah, so healthcare is included in here, and Jenny, you're giving me a nice lead into the next slide. So you asked at the last meeting, what's the impact of healthcare on GSP? And Mark bravely volunteered to help us try to figure this out, and using the best available data, and I'm going to explain what that means. He performed the calculation and he found that the impact of healthcare was not material, which is probably counter to what a lot of us were thinking, right? But part of this is a limitation in terms of what data are available. So the data include some provider direct services, but other sources of economic activity like health insurance are not included. So we know that it's not complete. Mark, anything you want to add?
No, that's correct. So the Bureau of Economic Analysis, when they put out the gross state product, do separate it by different industries. And so the exercise was just to pull out the healthcare-related industries and see if the growth rates were different. While healthcare is a big chunk of the economy, in terms of these growth rates over time, we really didn't see significant differences whether it was a move or not.
And the assumption going to the PGSP for the 2025-2029 was an inherent assumption for healthcare. Kind of run rate-ish.
I would assume so. Again,
yeah, if you look at the formula on slide 28.
When we estimate the PGSP at slide 28, we're doing it so at a much higher level. So we're not looking at individual industries, but we're just looking at the overall labor force and overall productivity. Now, obviously, healthcare industries have a different productivity profile than the average industry, but this was just looking at the average industry.
Mark, to try to paraphrase, but I don't want to put words in your mouth if I get this wrong, correct me, but this is not reflective of the amount that we're spending on healthcare or how much that's changing from year over year. It's more indicative of sort of the output, how much healthcare we're providing. Is that fair?
Absolutely, Jeremy.
All right, so hold on to 3.5 and 3.8 in your brains for a minute, and we're going to switch over to looking at wage and personal income growth. I want to note that
I just wanted to let Ruby and Jack know that we're on slide number 31.
Thank you. So this is, I just want to note, this is different than what we sent out to you in your packet in advance, because we did some additional work. We found that, particularly in terms of looking at average wage and personal income growth, that we have some problems of comparability. And so we changed this a little bit because we wanted to feel confident that the figures were comparable. And so what we are sharing with you now is, oh, this is not the updated deck, I just noticed that. Thanks, Mike. So do you have it so that I can speak to it? Okay, so I'm going to speak to what you do not see in front of you quite yet. So instead of giving wages and salaries and personal income, we went to hourly wage and household income. And that's because we found that the figures that we had, as I said, just were not exactly comparable. We also decided to focus on median value because we had problems with comparability of the average values. Now, what we also remember from the last meeting is most of you were actually more interested in median values than in average values. So I'm glad that the problem we had with comparability was on average and not median. That was a convenient problem. Okay, so hourly wage is compensation that you get as an employee or a contractor, and I think speaks to itself. Household income is all the payments that come into one household. It's not an individual, it's a household. Okay, and obviously households vary in size. Okay, for these two measures that reflect personal economic experience for Oregonians, we were able to provide both median historical and forecasted values. So here are the values. You can see for wages, the historical is 2.7 and the forecast is 3.9. There's a big difference there. The median is not the full 20 years, but Mark has told us that adding on the 3 additional years would have a de minimis impact on that 2.7%. The median household income looks a little bit different. It was higher in the 20-year look back and lower in the forecast. But what you will note with all of these figures that we've looked at is that they are all, with the exception of the median wage, they're somewhere all coming between 3 and 4%. That has not been a surprise to us because when we've looked at these data in the other states, it's been about the same there too.
And household income includes transfer payments, yes?
Yes.
Okay, so which is our...
We're still somehow moving on this.
Okay. Okay. All right. So here you can see both the economic and the personal income measures together. Yes.
Make a request. I
Sure.
feel like we don't have to go into it now, but I'd like to know why the forecast for the median income is so dramatically different than the historical, the last 20 years. Like, if you look at the last 20, on the median wage, sorry, yeah, median, not median income, median wage. When you look at the growth in the economy and everything else tracked, and I'd like to talk about why after 20 years, suddenly, median workers are gonna have significant wage increases.
Mark, do you want to opine on these are the purchase values from IHS, right?
Yeah, in terms of the median forecasts, roughly yes. They are. A lot of it is driven by, at the U.S. level at least, by their outlook. But nevertheless, a lot of the issues in terms of this polarization and the damage that's been done to a lot of our mid-range industries or occupations, some of that will probably lighten up going forward, given that we've lost a lot of these repetitive jobs and are left with a much mix which is much more heavily weighted toward personal service and interaction type jobs that are much harder than a lot of them.
Yeah, I'm familiar with the lack of automation in those jobs. I guess my question is, there's an assumption that there's going to be an income growth in those jobs, and over the last 20 years, there's been very little income growth in those jobs. So I'm happy to talk about it during the break. I don't think it's...
Yeah, I
don't
think we can provide you a very good answer because these are purchase values from economic forecasting companies.
So okay.
Okay, we didn't calculate them.
We didn't calculate that.
No, the only thing that we calculated was the PGSP value, which is the top right box.
Okay, and the other two were just purchased.
The other forecasts were purchase forecasts.
But part of the complicating factor here is it's not just following a given job and how much they're earning. Say, I'm a teacher, and how much am I making over the next 10 years? With the median, it's also about the mix of jobs. And so as that mix changes, that also affects expenses.
I have a quick question. When you look at forecasted versus historical, if you were to look at historical back sort of 5 years, 10 years, how well do those actually line up?
That's another Mark question.
Forecast accuracy? Unfortunately, economists are pretty crappy at forecasting the future, and so accuracy might not be our forte.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Unlike actually.
Yeah. So, all right. So this is our moment of reckoning, and here you have the inputs in which you express interest, and we provided you with both what was it in the past, and what do at least some forecasts say about what it might be in the future. You can see that the differences in the forecasts between the income and the economy are not wildly different. We do see, some differences historically in terms of the economy and personal income. But even then, we're not seeing enormous differences in any of these. And all of these are below what historical statewide spending trend has been in Oregon, as has been shared with you previously. So I would say with all of this as context, and probably also with the OHA, CCO, OEB, PEB 3.4 in mind, because that's context. I'd like to invite you now to engage in conversation. Oh, not yet? Oh, you have to do public comment, and then you'll engage in conversation. So ready your thoughts on this. We're going to invite the public to comment, and then jump in.
So at this moment in time, we're going to entertain public comment sessions related to selecting the target. We have one individual that is signed up for that. All other public comment will be held at the end part of the meeting. We're going to hold to 2 minutes per person. So I'd like to ask Numi Griffith to come to the microphone, and it is your time for public comment.
Okay. All right. Good afternoon, honorable members of the Cost Growth Benchmark Implementation Committee. My name is Numi Lee Griffith. I'm the healthcare advocate for the Oregon State Public Interest Research Group, commonly known as OSPR. We are a consumer advocacy organization with over 30,000 members and supporters throughout the state of Oregon, and over the last decade, we've become a leading voice for the consumers on healthcare issues with our work on health insurance rates, drug prices, and others. This included our participation in the Healthcare Cost Review Task Force created by 2017 House Senate Bill 417, which ultimately resulted in the creation of this committee. We urge the members of this committee to adopt a target number for the cost growth benchmark that is less than whatever economic indicator is chosen as a peg. It is not sufficient to merely freeze healthcare spending at its current level relative to the rest of the economy. Healthcare spending in Oregon and the United States is already too high, representing nearly 20% of the gross domestic product nationally. Accordingly, the goal of this program should be to reduce the level of healthcare spending relative to the rest of the economy, not to merely maintain spending at its current relative level. When the Healthcare Cost Review Task Force discussed the advantages and disadvantages of various proposals to rein in healthcare costs, it identified several issues with the cost growth benchmark concept. One concern was the idea that the policy effectively freezes existing cost inequities in place, as it only measures changes in costs rather than differences in current costs across different entities in the marketplace. Similarly, setting the benchmark growth rate at or above the chosen economic indicator will freeze healthcare prices at their already overinflated level. Oregonians are already suffering from high healthcare prices. You don't have to dig far to hear stories of surprise bills, rising copays and deductibles, or aggressive debt collection practices by hospitals and provider groups. As both individual and group health plans continue to shift towards high deductible plans, this cost is increasingly borne directly by consumers. Accordingly, we urge the members of the committee to set an ambitious benchmark rate that aims to actually bring down healthcare spending relative to the rest of the economy over the long term, rather than merely settling for a number that preserves the status quo. Thanks for your time and attention.
Thank you, Numi, for your comments. Thank you for being here. I'd also like to ask if there's any other members of the public that would like to make a comment today that did not get the chance to sign in. All right. Hearing none, we will then adjourn for a 10-minute break, and then we will go on with the rest of the session. So if we could reconvene at 1:48. Let's say 1:50. We'll give 12 minutes because we're a little ahead. So we're going to reconvene at 1:50.
Thanks, Jeremy.
And our numbers are 18%.
Does that work better?
And the growth is considered to continue to grow. So everybody has 60 seconds to get back into their seats.
Very impressive, Kevin.
The time is 1:49, so let's get going.
Okay, so as I shared with you moments ago, OEB, PEB, and Oregon Health Plan have a 3.4% annual budget target. That's going to remain regardless of what comes out of this process today. It just sort of, it is, but it's important context to have. Okay, and you have the past and the forecasted growth. So, what should the cost growth target be?
Just to clarify too, so the 3.4% that's in our waiver that expired in 2022. So I mean, I think part of our goal here is to have something that we're pegging to once that sort of expires in our next waiver, and the 3.4% for PEB and OEB is in statute, so that will remain unless the legislature decides they want to replace it with whatever is chosen here today. But there's nothing that prevents any particular program to still try to shoot for a number that's lower than the target if we land at something that's higher than 3.4%.
Thanks. Ken?
So I want to validate whether my thinking is right or wrong. I sort of see two questions here. One is, what's the measure or the metric we're going to tie our target to? So, you know, we've gone through a bunch of measures. So what do we use as the index that we're going to relate to? And then it's, where are we relative to that? So the actual number. Is that?
Well, I mean, so ultimately what we want to do is to pick a number. That's the end product. We have given you data that can serve as guideposts that you can use to inform your decision. But they are just to inform your decision. You do not have to pick any of those. Well, I'm going to flip to them. You don't have to pick any of those three indices. Or if you do pick them, you can say, I want to pick, let's say, median income because that seems meaningful to me, or I want to pick the economy because that seems meaningful to me. But I want to adjust it because the rate that I think is right is X point Y%. So there is a push and pull interactive relationship here. Ultimately, what we want is a value. The question is, do you want to use any of those indices as your rationale for the value that you're selecting? And if so, what is the rationale? At the last meeting, just as a reminder, we sort of settled was economy, but we might want to modulate the value based on what wage and income tell us.
You know, and I agree with Numi's testimony, though. One piece, though, that may sound counter to that, it seems like a big missing piece of data we have is where we are from a baseline standpoint.
So OHA shared that much earlier. So the overall spending rate, per capita spending rate was 6.
Yeah, from what we have in the APAC, from 13 to 17, it was spending. Again, this is spending, not premiums. Was 6.5% per capita between 13 and 17. Obviously, you know, that varies by market a little bit. Medicaid was lower, Medicare was a little higher. You know, commercial was about that, but you know, then you could break it apart by self-insured and fully insured. But commercial was about that. Medicare was a little higher. Medicaid was a little lower.
Thanks, Jim.
Jen?
I was also under the impression that part of the task was to pick what the indicator would be, and not just the values, such that 5 or 10 years from now, that same indicator would be used to update the values. So I felt like Ken explained that there was a methodology component and a value component.
There's both, right? So I'll harken you back to the examples from some of the other states. In
Massachusetts, they just picked PGSP period for several years, and then they said we're going to do PGSP less an adjustment factor, and they had a rationale for that. In Delaware, they said we want to pick PGSP, but we want to find a glide path to get there, and so we're going to do PGSP plus. So in those two states, they said yes, PGSP is what we want. But they didn't stick literally to it for all of the years. They modified what that value was for different reasons. So you can, if it would be easier, first pick one of these as our guidepost, and then you can have a conversation. So do we want to modify what that value is for whatever reason might occur?
And then a later conversation will be, and when do we come back to it, under what circumstances?
Right. But for right now, let's just think about what would an initial cost growth target be.
One more question. Does the legislation require us to pick a methodology and identify that as an output of this work?
So it asks for you to pick a target and for you to have it be informed by economic indicators.
So doing a quick check with Jack and Ruby, now that we've reconvened, can you hear us and can we hear you?
I'm able to hear you.
Great. Jack?
Yes, I can hear you guys just fine. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much.
Any other questions? Okay. Anybody want to put a first proposal on the table for discussion by the committee?
Hey, Kevin, this is Jack. I did have a question, if I could. Is that okay?
Absolutely.
Jeremy, you mentioned that the aggregate per capita spend baseline in our state was, what, 6.5? Is that what I heard?
Yeah, just from 13 to 17, and again, from what we have in the all-payer claims database, the biggest thing that's missing from that is self-insured. We have some self-insured, but not others.
Okay, but that does include the percentage of spend that was being borne by individuals, right? That's not just premium trend. That's total per capita spending, including the percentage spent by the users, right?
Yeah, I believe that was allowed claims, so it would include both the insurer and the individuals.
It would. Okay, that's what I needed to know. Thank you very much.
I think the question is about the period itself covers not the same sensitive control population. Right. You have a market expansion into it, so to what extent that potentially inflates?
That was a per capita figure, but you're right. It was over the Medicaid expansion. We know, looking back a little farther, that I think from 2001 to 2014, we had a figure that was about 4.14%, something like that. We were still fourth highest in the nation. So, but we have seen, everything seems to be indicating we've been on an upswing the last 4 or 5 years.
I would like to propose that whatever methodology that we pick there, but that we look at historical rather than projected. I am not a fan of projected numbers. I feel like we have a much better chance of getting a more accurate target if we're looking at historical.
Jessica, when I was flippant there saying that economists can't forecast, we can do a little bit more accurate than the ruler, just the historical trend, but I would argue that the historical trend may be appropriate anyway. Two things. One is it's very transparent and anyone can calculate it in their living room. And the second thing is it'd be very stable. As we go from year to year, that 20-year trend doesn't change much. And so providers and you folks in the industry will pretty much know what that is over time and can
Although, Mark, I'd like to separate the issue of how often it gets updated from what it should be. Because you could pick a historical figure and say, we're just locking that in. That's what we're going to use for the next X years until we revisit. So that issue of how it gets updated, I'd like to put that aside for right now. But I do think that your proposal, to look at historical is something certainly worth discussion and invite other people to comment on.
Go ahead, Felisa.
I'm ready to put out a number. Are we in this bidding situation that you're suggesting?
Yeah, so I would encourage you, if you put out a number, also to let us know, do you think it should be tied to any of these indicators, and what's your rationale for the relationship?
So we'll put out a 3.4% to start with, mainly because it's sort of in between the median wage and the PGSP historical trend. And it's across the other markets that we've discussed already in our Medicaid market and in the PEB and OWEB market. And then I would suggest, when I think the next question will be over time, a ratcheting down of that number.
Okay, so I just want to say back what I've heard. So 3.4% because for two reasons. One is it falls sort of in between some of the historical figures, and two, because it's the OEB, PEB, OHP. Okay.
I think we'll just ratchet it down over time.
Right. Okay. Other thoughts?
I guess for me, because it's fairly close, and I think we're asked to pick a methodology, I would use the GSP, and I know it's close to the 3.4 at 3.5, but at least it's a methodology instead of tying it to something that like OHP or PEB and OWEB, which was done in the past. So my recommendation, I guess, would be the GSP at 3.5, I guess, and then we can discuss over what period of time do we use it.
This is Ruby on the phone.
Go ahead, Ruby.
I can go along with the GSP at 3.5, but when we get into the discussion about how we're going to change this over time, I think we need to start looking at wage and income data, because wage and income data may determine whether or not people can afford to pay. So I think we need to pay attention to that in our state, because we really don't have a looking glass into the future.
Right. So we will be talking next about the question of how often the value is revisited and how it's revisited. So why don't we come back, Ruby, to your suggestion when we move to that next conversation.
Yeah, that would be helpful. And then I also just want to make a quick note that I'm not so sure that we're actually hitting these targets now. Right now in 2020. So we're not really showing that data. We're not sure about that. So that would be helpful as well, unless I missed it somewhere in the discussion.
No, you are right. I think, all signs are that we are not hitting this, which is really our whole reason for being here.
Yeah, Ruby, this is Pat. I am sure, and we're not. Although it does, in fairness, depend a little bit on exactly what you're talking about, because this 3.4% number gets used in about 3 or 4 different ways in different contexts that in at least 1 or 2 of them we have historically but not recently been meeting. So we're trying to do some work on that right now to come up with a coherent way to describe that.
So I have Jessica and then Jenny.
Thank you, Pat.
Sorry, is it my turn?
Oh, yeah.
Okay, good. So when I look at the indicators here, I really still think that we should be looking at wage data or a wage-based indicator. There is a pretty big difference between the 2.7 and the 3.8. If you kind of, they're sort of apples, oranges there a little bit. But I think that if we're trying to sort of get healthcare into a position where it's affordable for people, we've got to look at their ability to pay for it and their ability to generate income. I would say the total household income, and it includes transfer payments. I'm a little bit fuzzy about where all of that's coming from. Some of it's in the form of payments that are coming back to that individual through Social Security and whatever other assistance they're getting, which kind of skews it slightly, right? So it's not their sort of individual ability to generate income or sort of what that looks like for them. So I think that that really is the right number to tie it to. Then when we look at what the target should be, I'm okay if we sort of, give ourselves a little time to catch up to sort of ratcheting down, right? But I think that we need to start with something that's real for people.
So I have Jenny and then Andrew. Go ahead, Jenny.
I agree with Bill. GSP 3.5%, and as we scan through other states' data, and that is a comparable range, and I think it's really very close with 3.4, whatever the wisdom and intelligence go into the Pebble Web ones. The other one is really for, frankly, market stabilization. If we are not there to taking a 9/10 of points, 1 point down, and as a target for 2021, it just it could have unintended consequences. So pegging with the GSP just allows a consistent methodology. Then we get to the how fast, how long to get to it, just more economic point of view.
Andrew?
Thanks. Just a question, just to be sure how you want to structure the decision-making. If it's just on picking the methodology that gets the number, or if at the same time any adjustments to that?
Yeah.
Because if you said historical GSP minus 0.1%, that would hit a lot of the comments or suggestions so far.
Yeah, you are welcome to say, I think it should be tied to GSP or to wages, but I think it should be plus or minus something. Feel free to say that, and please, as you all have been doing, share a rationale so that the others around the table can understand the basis for whatever you're proposing.
Go ahead, Jordan.
Mark, I might have to borrow my chart back. So my mind goes a little bit to where Numi was going. So just for a tracker guy, I had to put it in Excel, but it basically takes the inflation rate, which is right now 2.8% for the West, and then it adds in 25 basis point increments to tell you year by year what additional wallet share the individual is going to be paying, to Jessica's point. At 3.5%, 15 years out, you're at 10% additional wallet share. One generation out, you're at 20% additional wallet share for medical. So at least at that number, at the current inflation rate, I'm feeling better that at the growth rates that we're at, it's an entire generation before we're 25% out. It will be interesting to get into the conversation from a timing perspective, how often that gets reevaluated, because it's all, in comparison to what the actual inflation rate is and how folks can absorb it, and whether or not those wages stay out ahead as they're projected to be. I'd be really optimistic to see a 3.5% rate, whether you call it median income or whether you call it GSP, and a forecasted income rate that's at 3.9. I'd be really optimistic about that.
So Craig and Shannon, how is this resonating with you?
I think the way this is ending up, I'm supportive of tying it to some sort of economic indicator, just so as things change over time, it can be reset. And then I also agree with making some adjustment for where we want to go or where we're coming from. So I'm kind of waiting for that part of the conversation too.
I like looking at the historical as opposed to the forecasted, definitely. And it feels like we're all kind of around the same number, 3.4, 3.5. So it feels like we're landing in a good spot. And so I like the historical look back too.
So there's been a lot of nodding heads in the room, Jack and Ruby, related to historical lookbacks. Catherine, William, how's this resonating?
So I agree with tying it to the economy. I thought we ended up in a pretty good place at last meeting where we talked about tying it to an economic indicator but adjusting it based upon either wage or income. Personally, I think wage is a better way to go. maybe that's just because I understand it. But that's the conversation to have from my perspective is, and if it's 3.4 or 3.5 GSP, I'm sort of ambivalent about that.
Yeah, and I've already provided my comments to you on the GSP.
Ken, what about yourself?
I think I like the overall direction of the conversation. I like using the GSP. To me, the key is going to be time frame, because if we're talking about essentially pulling 3 points out of the system, we need strategies to. I mean, not this group, but overall, we need some significant strategies to make that happen. So and then ratcheting down from there. So time frame is going to be real important to me.
And Jen, have you been able to speak?
I would agree. I like GSP. I think it's a known number that can be relied upon, or a known methodology that can be relied upon. And I think it's a starting point. I do think that, as Ken mentioned, the glide path is going to be very important, because there could be, or we want to be aware of unintended consequences if we go too fast or too slow, both directions.
Ruby, on the phone, you were able to make some comments earlier. Anything to add?
Yeah, I just want to be extra careful not to run off our boomers who are either going to be or already on fixed income. And so their wages and income will not be rising, it will be staying the same. And as that next generation moves into that category, we want to make sure that we actually have a tax base in our state to fuel our overall economy. So I want to be extra careful of that as we make these decisions.
Thank you for that, Ruby. And Jack?
I've been listening, Kevin, and really have appreciated the comments. I don't have a lot to add. I am a proponent of a growth state product with a wage growth kind of blend. To me, a 3.5% kind of a figure seems like a rational one. So I'm supportive of where we're headed, and I don't know that I would add much.
Thank you, Jack. John?
I don't have much to add. I'm supportive of where we are and where the discussion is.
Patrick, you already made some comments. Anything else to add?
Yeah, I would just say that as a target, I agree with everything that people have said about GSP as versus a forecast number. I think GSP minus something, with all the comments about glide path taken into consideration, GSP minus something is the right direction to go.
And Mark?
I don't have a dog in the fight, but when we do look at income, it is more broad than just the wage income and transfer payments. In particular, for seniors, you have pensions and IRA income, and for others, there's dividends, interest, and rental income, and all sorts of things. And so right now, in terms of the typical senior in Oregon, the Social Security is about a quarter of the income, and IRA is about a quarter, and pensions are about a half, in terms of the relative size of them. Over time, that's going to shift, with pensions becoming a smaller and smaller share, given that most employers have gone away from these direct defined benefit plans and into more contribution to the IRA.
Andrew, did you have additional comments?
I share Pat's views that what we should start with the GSP number and then have a negative adjustment to it.
All right. Are we landing on a
Good.
number
We're making
of
progress.
3.5?
Yeah, I think we're ready to go on to the next part of the conversation.
All right, let's do so.
Okay. So,
okay, I just want to,
all right, so I think where we're starting right now, I think where you all are right now is at historical GSP with some need for discussion about whether it gets adjusted and how it gets adjusted over time. Okay, but I think that's what I hear.
Yeah, I just want to make sure. So, I think Jessica, you had a strong opinion around median wage growth. So I think we want to make sure we land a spot where everybody, if the sort of proposal seems to be coalescing around GSP as the starting point, can everybody sort of live with that or not? And then and then it seems like we need to then get into the value and rationing it down. And are we rationing it down now or at some point in the future?
Right.
I would just like to make sure that we really don't forget about that number, because that is the income that people are generating, the wage that they're generating. And so, we can look at, GSP and all that, but GSP is a measure of output of physical things. It's not a measure of our ability to afford something.
Right.
And so it's different.
Yeah.
And I just, I know that the majority of everyone is okay with GSP, but I think that if we're trying to sort of get healthcare into a more affordable place, we really should be tying it to something that is dollars and cents in a real way.
I will note, though, there are many ways to get to where we're going, and whether it's potentially, because we're not there, whether it's GSP down or wages up,
No, and I get that. I think, it's very rare that I will stand on something from a sort of purely philosophical perspective, but on this, I feel pretty strongly about it.
Mm-hmm. Are we ready for me to move on? Just want to make sure people are comfortable.
Hi, this is Ruby. When we had this discussion last time, we actually had folks tying it to wages and income in their discussion. I did that, to be specific. So I want to make sure that we're not focused just flatly on the GSP, because I am not.
So your charter as a group says that you're going to try to make decisions by consensus. Most of you support the idea of using GSP. Some of you specifically have said so with an adjustment. And a subset of you do not support GSP, which I think is where we were actually at the last meeting, and would prefer wage or income-based indicators. So if we want to stay on this further, we can have the opportunity for further dialogue and for you to engage in one another to see if you can reach unanimity. You may not reach it. This is a pretty large group. But if you would like to spend more time on it to see if you can reach unanimity, we can do that. Again, I just want to note, and I totally appreciate, Jessica, the principle that you're espousing, because I can totally understand it. But aside from the principle of it should be the economy or it should be income, the absolute value that we're going to wind up on could be in the same place. I just want to note that that's a possibility.
And this is Ruby again on the phone. Based on your slide number 38, would this be a place where number 3, should the cost growth target be adjusted over time, and could we add into that, and how?
Oh yes, for sure.
Because, okay, and how might be based on wage and income or wages. So I did not think it was a yes or no. I thought that we were having a yes and discussion.
So, again, you all can decide how you want to proceed. What I was suggesting was that based on the preponderance of the group, we go with GSP potentially adjusted. If you want to spend more time on whether it should be wage or income potentially adjusted, we can do that. Pat?
I want to come back to Felice's original suggestion, which was 3.4, based on reflecting the fact that it's more or less tied to GSP, but with basically with a nod toward the notion that the wage rates are lower. I think, aside from it, being a number that much of us are already used to, that's enough of a tie, I think, to be in the same ballpark, but having anchoring in some basic principles that we're also trying to talk about. And again, with the notion that we're not talking about next year, we're going to be at 3.4% for everything. We have to figure out strategies and a glide path and all that sort of thing. I still think that's probably the best result.
I think, though, Pat, I think it will be harder in the future to administer this program if it's not explicitly linked to some indicator.
So call it GSP minus 0.1.
Right. But so what I was trying to say is it sounded to me like most of you were okay with GSP adjusted. So my suggestion to you is that we go on and use GSP adjusted, and then we spend time, as Ruby said, looking at that slide 38, at the question of, so when is it adjusted and how is it adjusted?
So can I jump in just
Please.
real quickly? Because I think that I agree with Jessica on the tying to the economics around healthcare and a person's wages is very critical, because people cannot afford their healthcare right now and are making terrible decisions for their own personal life based on their ability to buy and afford healthcare. So just owning that, I think, is very important. I think then choosing that number, because we're picking a number, so I'm not super wedged to this idea of GSP versus median income. I think that there could be some combination, and I think it doesn't tie us to that forever and always. I do think that the reality of going from a 6.5% to a 2.7% will put an incredible strain on an industry that is used to doing whatever they want at this point within some market constraints. So how does an industry start at a 6.5 and then move to a 3.5 and then get to a lower number eventually, to Numi's point? I think all of those components, I think we sort of can collectively agree upon, right? We agree that income is a concern when it comes to healthcare costs, right? And just sort of looking around the table, and everybody's staring at me, but I'm just going to say we agree that income is a concern, that healthcare is a concern. So some not. So the second thing we agree on is that going from 6.5 to 3.5% is a big leap, right? That's a challenge. I think that the third piece that we agree upon is that healthcare is too expensive and eating up too much of our GDP. So with those sets of agreements, if we started at that 3.5% minus 0.1, to Pat's point, that sort of gives a nod to the 2.7, but then we had a glide path to get to median wages. I keep saying income, but I really mean median wages, sorry. If we had a glide path to get to median wages, where it sort of starts to track with that at a later date, and we're not so hung up on that economic indicator and more hung up on what that specific number is, because I think that's a part of the rub. Is that something that we could get to?
I mean, I agree that we don't, it would be, it's not a good idea to ask anybody to sort of cut that steeply. I mean, you're going to have a pretty big disruption in across the system, right? So 2.7 right now is not achievable. I think at first, right? We're going to get there, but I think we can't just sort of say, okay, that's it. 2.7 is the target. But my issue is that if we tie it to something that is other than wages, then you're really losing the essence of why we're trying to do this. And I know that's a philosophical argument, but I am okay going with a 3.5 minus 1 or whatever we decide on, but I think the indicator that we're looking at should always be tied to something real for people.
Right, so you could say wages plus 0.8, right?
I'm okay with that, yeah.
And then have it come down.
If I may, if Oregon were an island all by itself, there wouldn't be a difference between GSP and income. These two things would be exactly the same. But the difference here is that with GSP, two things. One is there are a lot of owners of capital as shareholders in California or in Timbuktu that are earning money out of Oregon, and there's also the federal tax system where we send money out and get some benefits back, and those things, you really divorce the connection between income and output. So really this output, to go to that is to really say that we also care about, like I say, the makers and takers at the federal level, as well as you know, the money that we're shipping out to shareholders in other states.
So I don't have the data for Oregon, but I do pull the growth rate of the what is it? The full description is the total private average hourly earnings of production and non-supervisory employees. So we're talking the people, right? It's a national one, but I pull it monthly just as part of my economic report within our business. It's currently at 3.3%. So part of what may be a bit of a rub in this conversation is that we've gone back 20 years to look at wage data to try and take out cyclicality, which I can wrap my mind around from a GSP perspective. I'm not sure I'm all the way there on going 20 years back to look at wage data. So I'm not sure that the 2.7 number as it sits today, as we're talking about the folks, the real people, the folks who are opening up their wages, working hourly, and trying to pay their monthly contribution towards their health benefit plan, in that 3.5% range today is where I think we're still doing a good job as stewards of what Oregonians need us to be looking for. Does that make sense? So I'm just throwing that out there. Nobody else has that data. You gotta think that a tractor guy can pull data, but 3.3% is kind of where it sits nationally. I don't know where it sits at the state.
Yeah, so at the U.S., throughout the last several years, we've seen an acceleration in wage growth to somewhere just around 3% or a little above, as you say. In Oregon, it's been 4 or 5 years now. We've been bouncing between 3 and 4%.
So I want to come back to Pat's proposal. So could folks live with 3.5% adjusted by 1%, 0.1% to show it, to have a nod, and then let's move to a discussion of when and how do we adjust it, and under what what mechanism to try to make sure it's coming down more in line with wage growth. Are folks generally there?
And Jeremy, you're proposing not to tie it to any economic indicator to get us out of our conundrum. Is that what you're suggesting?
Well, I think we're using GSP, but we'd be adjusting it based off of understanding what wage growth is on, and in the future would also be continuing to look.
Okay, so GSP minus instead of wages plus.
Yes.
Yeah.
But did I just hear, though, that wage growth has actually been between 3 and 4%?
I think that was average. Yes, average rather than median, but yes, it's in Oregon, it's been somewhere between 3 and 4. I said 4 years, it's probably 5 years now that we've accelerated into that range.
I would encourage us, though, not to get hung up on what's happening short term, because we're trying to find something that's going to give us a stable, longer term trajectory. And as we've noted, things go up and down regularly. We're trying to create some target that will be constant into the future.
But we were trying to use a 20-year look back to adjust by a 0.1. So that's where it's not making sense now to what's going on with reality today. That's my only comment there. The GSP, so we've got 3 questions, right? Question 1 is the indicator. Question 2 is for how long. Question 3 is should it be adjusted? And so do you take each one of those individually instead of trying to tie 1 and 3 together all at the same time?
Yeah, there's no one right way to do it.
Yeah.
Okay. So I'd like to go back to my acknowledging Felisa's and Jessica's comments. It sounds like the majority of you want to stay with GSP. This is, to Jessica's point, more about the narrative than it is about the value, okay? And she's made a point, there's power in narrative. Yes, I agree there is. But it still sounds like the majority of you are not swayed by that.
Andrew, did you want to say something before that?
To point out, not to complicate this, but if Mark actually gets this right, wage growth is expected to outpace economic growth in the future, which could complicates using wage as the peg. If that's right, and if we want to get a lower number. And if we want to really build on Numi and others' comments about having the target actually reduce expenses over time, you probably want to have whatever we pick and then do a negative adjustment.
Pat?
Just a reminder that the bill doesn't actually require us to pick an economic indicator. It says pick a number based on being informed by economic indicators. And I think pick whether it's 3.5, 3.4, 3.1, 2.7, whatever. I think we've certainly now been well informed about the indicators and can check that box. And I think we should simply pick a number because I think this is a box canyon around the indicator.
So we started out the discussion with a 3.4, then we went to a 3.5. If I was an auctioneer, I'd start to move us upwards, but I don't think I want to do that. Are we comfortable with 3.5? If we're just merely looking at a number now.
I think the 3.4 is what's on the table.
Okay. Is that everybody's recollections? 3.4 is on the table? I'm seeing nodding heads. That's a good sign of consensus. Could we all support that?
So I can support the actual number, but given what the other states have gone through, I'm concerned about not tying it to an indicator, whether or not as we adjust a glide path over time. So 3.4 now, and if that's the number, that becomes our starting point, and how we adjust up or down, not tied to an economic indicator, it doesn't feel logical to me. So
can I just clarify something about, so Massachusetts has calculated their PGSP in 2012, and they've never recalculated their PGSP for the purposes of the target. They said it's going to be this for 5 years, then we're going to lower it for 5 years, then we're going to give the Health Policy Commission an opportunity to pick a number, but they've never recalculated it. So and as we'll talk about, Delaware and Rhode Island have that as, I think, what we call an escape hatch to do that recalculation, but they haven't actually, in Massachusetts, where this is the longest running program, they haven't actually recalculated it.
Yeah, Kathy, I think it would be easier if it was tied, but I don't think that you have to. You could say 3.4% for X years, maybe plus or minus over those X years, and we decide that after year Y, we recommend that after year Y, a like body come together and look at all these indicators again and decide whether to reset. You could do that. It's not what other states have done, but I don't see anything wrong with it.
I have a question. So I've heard reasons for tying it to median wage or whatnot, but I haven't heard anything other than it's a well-known number to tie it to GSP. I mean, it doesn't. I haven't heard any real reason to tie it to that other than it's a widely accepted number.
So in other states, people who have liked it.
Besides the other states that have done that.
Well,
right?
even in here too.
Yeah.
People have said, healthcare shouldn't grow faster than the rest of the economy.
No. I mean, I haven't heard a really sort of good argument for picking GSP versus median wage, other than it's a well-known accepted number. I mean, yes, we have to pick I think there's, that's the choice, right? We don't want to pick nothing.
Yeah. Well, but before we go there, it seems to me like the option on the table right now is to pick a value and not to tie it to any indicator. And would you be comfortable with that? It wouldn't be tied to GSP, and it wouldn't be tied to wages. Right?
Jordan?
I'm a bit confused on that one because right now it seems like we're looking at 4 numbers, and 3.4, 3.5 fits sort of inside the hash marks, right? So it feels to me a little bit like, to some of us, median wages are very important. Being able to look Oregonians in the eyes and saying, look, we're trying to do this to make Oregon a more livable place. And we can't make that argument based on GSP. For others, GSP has been brought up as the number they gravitate towards. I'm a little bit like Jessica. I'm not sure I fully understand it, but I don't know that I need to. To me, it seems like if we said this committee informed in part on GSP and in part on median wages, looking at these data points, agreed on 3.4%.
Right. I think that's the idea that's on the table right now.
Is that, and I'm trying to bounce that off you a little bit, Jessica, to see if that gets me.
I think I'm okay with that. I think the issue would be what happens in the future, right? How is the process going to be informed when we relook at this number? And if we don't set a precedence now, we're going to be, I don't know what that's going to look like in 5 years or
But you
longer.
could say, as Jordan just said, we're picking this after considering median wages and PGSP, and we recommend that after X years, median wage and GSP data again be re-examined to potentially update the value.
I'm okay with that.
Well, I was just going to add, there is a little bit of logic, I think, in that approach in the sense that wages are growing faster than or lower than the economy, and healthcare is growing faster than the economy. If we were able to bring healthcare more in line with the economy, what happens with wages? And if it's still not picking up, then you come back and say, well, we've got more work to do.
All right, I want to jump forward.
Can we just get to do a confirmation on the decision before we jump forward so that we don't come back here next week and look at your decision sheet and be like, no, I didn't make that decision. So Kevin, maybe you can repeat, and then we can all just thumbs up if you agree, thumbs down if you don't, sideways if you're just going to live with it. Sort of very base consensus level type decision making.
So what I've heard from what I've heard from the group is that we have picked a number of 3.4 based on historical data that was available to us, and that we will then proceed further with a date and a time range that we will be looking at the GDP and growth of the median income to help set further rates in the future.
Yeah, but I would say that you all picked the 3.4 based on a consideration of historical median wage and GSP.
All of the information that was provided to us. It wasn't just one element, it was an aggregate.
Should you land on it's the two, though? It's historical GSP plus historical median wage. Those are the two that folks want to continue to look at.
I'm seeing nodding heads. Yes? Okay. Jack and Ruby on the phone, are you good with that?
Yeah.
Yes, I am.
Great. We have a number.
Thank you all. All right. So the next question is, with what frequency should the cost growth target be reevaluated and updated? So as Megan indicated, Massachusetts actually set it for 10 years. They said it's going to be one level for 5 years, and it's going to be one level less, 0.5%, for another 5 years. Okay, that's a long time without any reconsideration. Finally, in year 11, there is an opportunity to reevaluate. In Delaware, they set it for 5 years. They have a methodology that has what they call the transitional market adjustment, where they're coming down to their target, but they have an advisory committee to the Secretary of Finance that annually reviews the target. Now, they've tied to the PGSP forecast, so they are essentially recalculating the PGSP every year. And then if they decide it's material, the change in PGSP, then they can change. Rhode Island, they didn't do 10 years, they didn't do 5 years, they did 4 years. And theirs is just flat. It's one value for 4 years, no change. They have an escape hatch provision that says if there's a highly significant change in the economy, then they might reconsider. But I can tell you that their oversight body has chairs who believe that that no economic changes should trigger a revisit, and so I'm not sure that they would ever revisit it based on the discussions that we've had. So that just gives you a little context. We've got 10 years, 5 years, and 4 years in terms of the time period for revisiting, with 2 states giving themselves sort of an out clause if they think that there's some compelling reason, although neither of them have really defined the compelling reason in very practical terms.
Jack and Ruby were on page 43.
So, the first question for all of you, before we go on to even whether it should change over time, is when should it be revisited? When you set when you're setting this target methodology, for how many years would you like to set it before someone like all of you needs to come together and revisit it?
So let me maybe start the conversation by just setting kind of a minimum range that I think is almost just a practical issue. So let's say if we go into effect in 2021, we're at the end of 2022 before we really have the detailed kind of data that we need. We're at least mid-year before we start to see the data, and then but by the time all the analysis is done, we're at the end of the year. So you're really 2 years in. And then I might argue that a lot of the strategies that are being put in place for 2023 are already in motion. So it feels to me the very smallest period of time should be 3 years. 10 years feels too long to me, but I would say no shorter than 3. I personally, I kind of like the 5.
Thanks, Ken. Yeah, that is important to consider, that the lag in getting data is such that you don't really know what performance will be until almost the end of the year after the first year of the target.
I agree with Ken. I think 5, for me, that would be the minimum, because it's going to take time to understand the data, know how to use the data, and produce change that we can see in the data. So I would be at 5.
May I ask a question about the 5? So that's 5 before there's any change in the number, but any change in the number. So we just say 3.4% for 5.
No, so we're going to have a separate conversation on whether the 3.4% should change over time. We're just saying that when you guys initially
Just
set
pick
it,
a number at 5. Got it. Okay.
you know,
I see
for
what you're saying.
whatever you decide on, how long should it be in place before somebody sits back and says, let's revisit this whole thing?
Okay. Okay. I would go longer then, but okay.
Other opinions?
I had a question about OHA and how often they're updating there. So you said 2022 is when it's going to come up again, and then is that for 2 years, 3 years, 4 years?
Yeah, I mean, it was never really established in the way that it would be revisited at a certain point. It was part of our original waiver for 5 years, then it got extended for 5 years, so for Medicaid, so it'll be up in 2022. For PEV and OEB, it's in statute right now at 3.4%, so it won't change unless the legislature passes a bill to change it.
So when I'm trying to set a goal or a target, I'm trying to balance hope and hopelessness in that goal and target, right? And I think we all feel it in various compensation packages. If you don't set it right, nobody feels like they can hit it, and it doesn't actually motivate, right? And it's on both ways, right? We heard testimony earlier. If it feels like this is too high, you're going to have Oregonians feeling hopeless. If it feels like it's set too low, you're going to have the healthcare industry feeling like they can't hit it. So to me, I'm more interested in hearing the medical community right now give an idea of what sounds reasonably hopeful before reviewing it again. If it's 3 to 5 years, I mean, 10 years is like a prison sentence. I can't imagine setting something for 10 years without review. I don't know how Massachusetts got there. But if that sounds what you guys want, right? So I'm trying to figure out in that time frame. So I guess that's where I'm at. I don't have a strong opinion myself, but I do want to hear industry have a strong opinion on what seems reasonably motivating before we recalibrate.
A study from a data perspective. Massachusetts sets 10 with a 5-year don't have any change. So it really allowed the industry, if anything, collectively figure things out if there's a gap from even a target today versus where their current state, right? And Delaware simply grows up, allow truly a glide path, even hit to the number they're hitting it now. So it's really, I think it might be the pivoted conversation differently is what's an aggressive, realistic endpoint you want to get by the end of 5 years, then work backwards. I don't know complicated process or not. I'm just thinking reflecting Jordan's point, because the set of target is not try to kill somebody, right? It's set the target trying to make it a meaningful way to collectively make this more affordable for Oregon.
So I want to make a suggestion. Let's pause on 5 years right now as just a working model, and let's think about to what extent you would want the value to change if it was 5 years. We can then go back and revisit 5 years if you want, but it gives us something to play with. So if we're starting with 3.4%, should it be 3.4% for 4 years? Should it, as Jessica suggested, move down over time to get closer to median wage growth? What do you all think?
Is there anybody that thinks it should be earlier than 5-year review? Or are we feeling that 5 years and up is our range that we're looking at? When Jordan asked the question from healthcare, I'm just going to put on my CCO hat right now. And the years go by really, really quickly. And there's a lot of movement towards value-based payments, and that takes time to have discussions and rate settings with hospitals and physicians. And I worry a little bit that we might not be able to see some of our targets in a 1 to 3 year period because of the amount of conversations and change and that value-based approach that I'm more comfortable looking at it from a 5-year perspective. And I'm happy from the CCO side that we had 5 years to start to implement those necessary changes. I don't think we would have been as successful as we were if we were tied to something that was a 1 to 3 year plan.
This is where I'm a little surprised, because I would go longer before the number gets completely redone. So I would have said that we would 5 years, and then the number gets ratcheted down, and then we did another 5 years, and then we revisit the process of setting a number. Sort of very similar to how Massachusetts did it, as opposed to going 5 years and then rehashing the conversation about is the number right, is the number right. So that it's a longer period of time. So at the end of the 5 years, if you're not exactly at that 3.4%, and it's gonna ratchet down to, I don't know, 3 or 2.7%, whatever, we can discuss that you still have some ability to make changes. And then my guess is once you look at if you go back to that very first slide about the different types of places where this is gonna apply, you're going to have different levels of success across each of those at various times. So to Kevin's point, like some folks might be able to adjust faster because they may have a higher Medicaid population. And so they're used to this and they're moving forward at a much quicker pace. And other folks may have a larger commercial population and they're like freaking out. So that's why I would think a 10-year period before we do this, because I also want to recognize that this is creating a lot of industry anxiety. And so how much do you want to create anxiety in a 10-year period as opposed to just kind of being really clear for 10 years and then revisiting?
I would also think that providing some sort of stability into this and predictability into the system is going to be really healthy, so that people can sort of figure out how they're going to, what their strategy is over the next several years to make that adjustment, because we're going from 6 something to 3.5, and I know if that was my business, it would take some time and we're talking about a big giant system, so I don't want to be insensitive to what it's going to take for people to make those adjustments. I think the 5-year, a gradual kind of ratcheting down of that number sort of makes sense. I don't know what would happen in 5 years if we came back to this table and kind of discussed a new target. It might look relatively the same, but I think the time for adjustment to get back down is going to be kind of, it's going to be more abrupt. So, you want to start a target, and then you want to slowly sort of allow for the entire system to sort of adjust to whatever the new reality is, right?
Craig, I'm wondering if you can weigh in with your actuarial expertise related to the time frame.
Well, yeah, I guess it's maybe actuarial in the sense that, as you mentioned too, time passes very quickly in this industry. And I agree that I think a longer time frame is probably wise, because we'll be back at this table in 3 years to set the next 5 years. So 5 years really isn't really 5 years before we're back here. So I like the idea of what Massachusetts did with having a longer time period, and then we can always intervene if there's something that's not working with that.
Are there more people in favor for a longer time period than shorter?
I was swayed by Felisa's argument. Doing it in sort of those 2 5-year chunks, I think, makes some sense.
Jack and Ruby, thoughts about time frame?
I like a 5-year. I think that makes sense. So I'm supportive of that.
This is Ruby. Having lobbied in Oregon, I always think in 2-year chunks. And so I would roll us forward to match what's already in play, and then connect them both and move forward, taking a look every 3 to 5 years. 5 years being the absolute maximum, because we don't know what's going to happen in our state, in our country. I'm trying to be realistic and hopeful at the same time.
We've heard 3 years, we've heard 5 years, we've heard 10.
Can we just repeat the 3.4 and what years? Because I got a little confused about time to reach the target and then reset the target. So could we go just quickly? If we, in 5 years, what is the target for each of those 5 years?
Well, so why don't we start with where do you want to get to, whether it's after 5 or 10 years? Because I think most of you are 5 or 10. So if you're starting at 3.4, where do you want to go to? And that might inform the time period.
And that's where we've said that we want somewhere between 3 and 5 to get to that number.
Well, we haven't said, because we haven't picked what the number is. We've said we're going to start at 3.4, I think, and then we want to. Some of you at least want to then journey down from 3.4, and if that's the case, then where are we journeying to? And then that might inform whether 5 years seems reasonable, or 7 years, or 10 years, or.
So I would agree that in the 5 years to get to the next target.
Whatever it is.
Yeah.
I'm seeing more nodding heads with the 5-year time frame. Am I correct?
Can I just jump in here a little bit? I feel like on the CCO perspective and looking at the CCO and the PEB data, I was just saying to Jordan, in the 5-year timeline, so I was on the Oregon Health Policy Board from the origination of the CCOs until 10 years because of Jeremy. But at the beginning, when we set that target and created the CCOs, the first 2 years was very exciting because there were all of these changes happening and people were coming together and we were seeing these things. The second 2 years was very demoralizing because all of those changes that happened and was very exciting didn't come to fruition fast enough. And you were at the second 2 years, you were like, is this really going to happen? And then the next 2 years was a little bit more exciting where you kind of saw that trajectory and the changes start to come to implementation and fruition. And then over the last period of time, it got more exciting and we kept pushing it along. I feel like if you don't have those small successes that you see without change, it will cause I don't want to say trauma's too much of a word, but a little bit of panic, frankly. And so I think to Catherine's point, and look, I'm the first one to argue that we should drive down healthcare costs as fastly and as aggressively as we can. However, I do feel like that 3.4% stays in place. Then we have a clear number. I would argue that that should be at that 2.7% for the next 5 years. So we do 5, and then we would drop it to the 2.7, and then for another 5 years, then allowing that kind of wave of success and coming together and change that needs to happen. And then at the 10, because I think you're asking us the question, when does this group reconvene and say, brand new number. And I think, and that could be 8% at that point. It could be 1% at that point, right? Because a new group will come together and make that suggestion. And if you don't do it for a long enough period of time, then what's the incentive to meet that first number? When you're like, okay, well, we're going to do it for 3 years. We'll just wait it out, and let's see at the end of 3 years what new number we're going to get. Or we're going to have bad behavior and drive it up a little bit. So at the end of the 3 years, we'll just sort of come together and be like, JK, we didn't do it. Like.
Okay, so Felicia's given us a proposal on the table, 3.4 for 5, 2.7 for 5. If you don't like it, say something. If you love it, be silent.
I agree the first 3 year 5 is a good healthy starter, knowing that currently the industry is not at 3.4. Okay, it would take 3 years to figure out what we're even doing about it, frankly. The second 5 year is, I think, the data becoming challenge. Is a 2.7 is still going to be the number look like with the potential wage rates, everything like that. I am sensitive to dipping below 3. Just a number somehow resonate with me by looking all that other states doing. Get to a 2 point some is a big, tall order for something far beyond with all the policy can change. So I would say floor, to me, without knowing the crystal ball, 3 just feels as far you're going to put that much in one basket.
This Jack, I don't know why we feel a need to have a second 5 year trend number at 2.7. That feels like a real stretch goal. It would be great if we could achieve it, but I think it's a big lift. Is it necessary that we have a second 5 year trend number in place, or can we simply say we're comfortable with 3.4 for 5, and we will adjust up and down as we see fit?
Or you could do something in between. You could say 3.4 for 5, and you could pick another target for the next 5, let's say 3%, but say that prior to the next 5, you would revisit median wage data and historical GSP data and potentially revise the 3.
Gotcha.
I saw nodding
I would
heads
be
with
more
Michael's.
comfortable with the 3% number for the second 5 years than 2.7, knowing what a lift that would be.
Right, but you've got an option then, with informed by actual performance and new data to adjust it.
I was seeing nodding heads
No.
with Michael's last proposal, or are there any of us that couldn't live with that?
So I don't know where I stand on this. I think I feel tension on 2 points. So when I think about what's going to push healthcare spending up, I think a strong signal from this group or the state to health systems about this is real and it's this is sort of the new reality, and so whether it's 5 years and it's updated or it's 10 years or whatever, I think a benefit from that is that on the margin, in the absence of a benchmark, you might have investments in proton beam accelerators or unnecessary sort of new hospital towers and things like that. If you send the right signal, then maybe we reduce that, and I think those are the types of things that probably maybe some of them we don't need, and if we can reduce those investments, then we can kind of kind of help slow spending over the long run. So that sort of puts me on the side of this longer term benchmark. On the other hand, we don't know exactly what things are going to look like, and so Sovaldi is a really good case study there. And I think the challenge here is if we sort of really pen ourselves in without escape hatches, and then we don't know what the unintended consequences of this are. And so Sovaldi is one. Another might be this. I don't know exactly how this works, but if it squeezes certain this is just Oregon doing its thing, and so if Oregon gets squeezed on, if it makes it harder to recruit certain specialists or whatever, then maybe we sort of feel like, oh, this is, yes, we want to get it down there towards wages, but there's some other things that we didn't realize were happening, but we're stuck with this 10-year thing. That makes me a little bit nervous. So I don't have an answer. I'm just going to inject more confusion.
Although I was proposing 5 years
Okay.
with a preliminary next 5 years and the opportunity for a revisit.
Which is, and so.
But you're putting a stake in the ground that the next 5 years would be lower, but with the opportunity to revisit.
And that's basically what Massachusetts did. I mean, they set it for 3.6 for 10 years, but they said at the 5-year mark, we could adjust that up to 0.5 percentage point, and they ended up doing the full adjustment downwards.
Down.
So in Massachusetts, it's been around for 7 or 8 years now. I don't know what was the transition like there. How long did it take them to know whether or not providers could match it? Can we take any lessons from that?
So providers and payers began matching it almost right away. But I will say that that per capita spending growth was in decline prior to Massachusetts doing it. So they had a slope that was going downwards. But they have, across all the years, this is a much earlier slide, they've been under it. So it has been successful.
Well, I'm just going to throw out maybe a proposal of would folks feel comfortable at the 10-year mark, at least 3.4 for 5, some ability to move down, a group to come together to figure out are we ready to move down at 5 years, and then a sort of full revisit at the 10-year mark.
So what's happening at 5? I'm not clear on that.
Some decision on whether either the group decides that we are for sure coming down to 5 years, or some group come together and revisit. Are we ready to make a 0.5 point reduction or some other reduction at the 5-year mark? Similar. I was just trying to mirror what Massachusetts did, basically.
But in Massachusetts, they had a trigger at 5 years.
They had an option of reducing it by 0.5 percentage point, right?
Not exactly. So the legislature said it will go down to 3.1% unless the Health Policy Commission convinces us otherwise that it needs to stay.
So that's what I was suggesting, something a little bit analogous to that, where you would say after 5 years it goes down to 3, but there will be a group that will come together to advise, looking at updated wage and GSP data.
So my concern is, at this point, we've been talking largely about inflation, actually product pricing changes. We were talking about this a little bit earlier, but it doesn't really take into account population swings or changes in the population in a meaningful way. So I worry a little bit if we let the time frame get too far out ahead of us, that either in-migration out of highly populated Washington and California could cause us a problem, or aging demographics changing dramatically could cause us a problem. So I'm not sure we're taking all of that into account, and I would, before we set something at a 5-year mark that said you're limited to a specific band that could give somebody veto power 5 years out to stay on a plan that was created without foresight to population change, I'm not sure I see that that's.
Yeah, no, I'm proposing in 5 years there just be a body like this that does a revisit. They say, all right, the default rate is 3. Let's look at what's going on in the economy and whether we think we should stay with the default rate or not.
I'm great with that. I don't know if you're allowed to propose that or not as a member of the committee or not, but I'm just commenting to Jeremy as well. We could set it here with a bandwidth. I'm not sure how comfortable I get with that one. But I'll take your proposal on the 5 years.
Well, no, so it's what I had put forth to you guys was 5 years at 3.4, and tentatively there'd be a default of 3% for the next 5 years, but after the initial period, which is going to be 3.5 years or something like that, a group like this would come together and say, do we want to affirm 3%, or do we want to make it higher or lower based on a consideration of new data?
So to clarify, I agree with your proposal. I was not as comfortable, I think, with what I heard from Jeremy.
So are people comfortable with this 5 and 10? Yes? Okay.
Andrew?
Yes.
Comfortable with it. A question. See, Rhode Island has an emergency escape hatch. You know, what were to happen, for example, the Supreme Court upholds the entire ACA being struck down, you know, our uninsured rate goes up by 10%.
If that happens, this won't make my top 100 list of things to worry about.
But is there an escape hatch built into this if significant things happen?
Right. So that's a good question, and thank you for asking it. So 2 other states have vague escape hatches that are tied to changes in the economy. Would you like to have one as well for either better defined or equally generally defined events?
Alicia?
I think the legislature is our escape hatch. It's a legislative bill. At any point in time, any citizen, really any citizen in Oregon, can bring a bill forward in the legislature to say, we don't want to do this anymore. And that legislative body can decide every 2 years, in fact every year now, whether or not this should go forward or not. So I would say the legislature is our escape hatch. And when there are economic downturns, they make other different decisions when there are economic upturns.
Can that move fast enough? So I'm just wondering if there's, so say something like this gets struck down, or there's sort of a, you know, new Sovaldi. I mean, how quickly can that happen fast enough?
I mean, the executive could call for an emergency session at any time. So if the reality is if the entire Oregon Medicaid program went to hell in a handbasket because of the Supreme Court decision, I assume there are 2 things that would happen. The E-Board would convene at the legislature to try to deal with the cost issue, which would be dramatic and huge in our state, and we would need to figure that out. That would probably happen within a month of the decision, leading up to the decision. And then the second piece that would happen is they would determine whether or not to call for a special session. Both the House, Senate, and the governor would make that decision. And that's an extreme case, right? That's a very extreme case. I think on the Sovaldi situation or any sort of economic, like those sort of costs jump forward, there could be a discussion about that at the legislature, whether it's time to reopen that or not. The reality is, even with Sovaldi, that doesn't mean that healthcare should have grown 6.5% in the last year. So I guess I wouldn't consider that a place where you would pull a ripcord. And I think an escape hatch is really meant to be a place where you pull the cord. And the legislature should pull that cord.
Yeah, remember, as Megan described earlier, when the Sovaldi thing happened in Massachusetts, they went over for Medicaid, and everyone talked about it. They looked at the data, and they said, this makes sense, it's understandable, let's move on. And we haven't talked about, you know, what the whole governance process is, but presumably you will build in a process like that where people will look at data and say, why did we go over? And where it makes sense that there was some externality that created it, people will say, okay, that makes sense.
So I'm just doing a time check, seeing we have to be out of the room at 3:30, and we do have public comment that is going to be upon us. We do have a proposal that we're looking at 3.4% over 5 years, and another group coming together at that point in time to see what the merits are of going to a 3%.
Well, I would say whether to move off of a default of what would be a 3% for the next 5 years.
Okay. Is everybody okay with that? Looking at
I
consensus.
got to throw a wrench in it. Just so when you can't come back together in 5 years to decide the next month, the number's different. So
yeah, right. It's 3.5 or 4 years it would actually come together.
Okay, fine.
Yeah.
Can anybody not?
Would you clearly repeat the proposal so that I can get what you've got?
Michael, could I ask you to repeat that
Sure.
proposal?
The proposal is that there would be a cost growth target of 3.4% for 5 years. In year 6, there would be a default move to 3% for years 6 through 10. However, prior to year 6, the future advisory body, to be named and to be discussed in another meeting, will revisit whether the 3% looks appropriate after considering median wage, updated historical data, and also updated GSP data, and any other externalities that might influence a decision, including performance data on how the state and providers and payers have done over the initial years.
That was a good summary. Can anybody not live with that? All right. You have consensus.
Wonderful. So I just want to pause at 3:09 to note that we have had a very rich, thoughtful couple hours of discussion. It has been so rich that we are, I would say, significantly behind where we had hoped to be at this point in the process. Okay? That's all good, because it's much better to have had the rich conversation we've had. I think that we're going to have to figure out what to do with our remaining 4 meetings to make sure that we catch up, because there's a lot in the bill that we still haven't talked about, including some of the other issues related to the application of the cost growth target. And we haven't even gone on to what we've been referring to as the data use strategy. So we have not made plans, but Jeremy, I'm suggesting that we might want to think about extending some of the future meetings to give ourselves enough time to finish this task, because I am guessing that you will be as thoughtful and engaged on the future topics as you have been to date.
Yeah, I think what we should do is revisit our calendar, and I think we can by email get that out to folks. We'll work with Jack and Kevin and get that out to folks if it feels like we've got to extend some meetings. But let's take that offline with Jack and Kevin and look at what the key decisions are between each meeting. We can get some document out to folks so you can see the roadmap that's ahead of us.
Okay, Kevin, the additional topics that we had on the agenda, even if we change the order, I think that they are all going to require more time for discussion than we have. So my suggestion would be that we go to the public comment.
Okay. We will do so then. We have 2 individuals that have signed up for public comment, and we'll transition into that component of the meeting. The first person on the docket is Tom Sinsick. So Tom, please make your way to the microphone. And as a reminder, you have 2 minutes.
My name is Tom Sinsick. I'm the president of Healthcare for All Oregon and a retired family nurse practitioner. It was very interesting discussion. I'd like to comment just on a couple of things that I've heard. I want to go back to the original slides that were in, I think, session 1 or 2, which showed that we are not doing well. We're paying too much, and we're not getting much out of it. And I didn't hear a part of this discussion as, we're going to contain costs, but what will the outcomes be? And is there going to be a commitment as a part of the process to protect people from medical bankruptcy as we're containing and limiting costs? Very interested in that piece. But I presented to you a piece of information about medical claims that I'd hope you'll look at in front of you that shows the claims processing that probably is going on. And I heard a presentation from DCBS a while back when I was in the school nursing task force that kind of described this kind of complexity in the system. And so I'm offering you now on the second page an idea that going forward to say, this is how you're going to start saving money. We have to get rid of this complex system, and patients will be appreciative of that. In addition, I think it's very important for this group to say there's another task force coming right behind. It's called the State-Based Universal Healthcare Task Force. And the design of that task force is to remake the system. So 5 or 10 years out, maybe we won't be even in this kind of discussion if we go with the direction that has been called for in Chapter 629 of ORS. And so I'd say this group should also take that into consideration as it makes its decisions going forward, because they're going to be the public and what Oregonians want is going to be very important. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Tom. Next, Andy Easton is on the list, representing the Oregon Association of Hospitals and Health Systems.
Good afternoon, committee. It is nice to be in front of you instead of our legislature down in Salem today, so thank you for the opportunity to spend a day up here in Portland. First and foremost, Andy Easton with the Oregon Association of Hospitals and Health Systems, and really want to extend our appreciation for the great work you guys are doing, looking at how we are going to control healthcare costs in our state. This work that you're doing is very thoughtful. You have put a lot of consideration into your decisions and recommendations that you are making today, and we appreciate that. You also are charged to do great things in a very compressed timeline, and so we recognize that. We want you to know that the association is here. We are fully involved and engaged in this conversation, and we all have something to benefit from its success. You have received a letter that we submitted to public comment. Most of those comments and questions we had were addressed today in this very thoughtful conversation, so thank you for that. You will probably see more of us engaged in these conversations going forward, whether it's an opportunity to do public speaking at your public comments or through the submission of comments. Again, I just want to thank you for your time and your commitment to this process. We do hope that we can be helpful in it, and we are standing by to make sure that we are all successful in addressing this cost curve. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andy. Is there anybody else in the audience that did not get the chance to sign up for public comment? So seeing no individuals, we did a remarkable job today. We have a number and we have a time frame. Now we have a lot of work ahead of us as we're building through the process, and that's going to take a lot of listening and thinking and time commitment. So we will be regrouping to see what we can do with extending the schedules for the next few meetings to get through all of the information that we need to get through. So any final comments before we adjourn this meeting and then plan to reconvene on March 10th? Okay. Seeing and hearing none, we'll adjourn for today, and thank you again.